Welcome to the Meeple Syrup Show, where designers discuss design. On episode 83,
Yeah,
Ready
eighth
Player
grade.
One. So we'll be talking about player count as the show gets going, and we'll be introducing who our guests are in a moment. But first, I got to jump to Tiffany and ask, what games have you been playing this week?
This week, well, it is a Tuesday. So far this week, we last night, Steve and I played Captain Sonar 2-player.
How was that 2-player?
It actually was a lot of fun. We had a blast. It was interesting. It was I mean, it's turn-based, so it's not real time, but it was basically yeah, it was what I wished Battleship was. Like it was really interesting. It was definitely a game of cat and mouse. And they did a really good job. I do after I mean, it was one play and one like map set, but I do feel that it does well at 2-player. So it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So how about you, Sen? What have you been playing for the last 2 weeks? Because we haven't seen you.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I played a whole bunch of Islebound last night. That was good. So that's by Ryan Lacout and Red Raven Games. Very Lacoutish in the look, obviously, because Ryan does all the art for his games. It's beautiful. It's a neat little game. There's a lot to like about it. It's kind of simple, but kind of good all at the same time. There's nothing too complex about it. You sail your ships around islands and you get resources, you trade them for things, you build buildings, you can attack with soldiers and sea serpents, because why not sea serpents? And then there's a really neat kind of influence mechanism there. So I liked how all the moving pieces work together. I think with every game, his games just get better and better. I wasn't a big fan of, as big a fan as some other people were of Above and Below, but I like where all his designs go. I think they all have something really neat about them. There's always something that's just a little bit quirky and a little bit special about Ryan's games. So I always try them. Like City of Iron was one of the first ones that I played of his, other than 8-Minute Empire, and that one again, it's like you're playing it and you go, I don't get this at all, and then all of a sudden it clicks just right, and you're going, now I get it. Islebound clicked really fast for the whole group, so we all quite enjoyed it. Other than that, I think we played Aliens versus Predators. So we got the Predator set of legendary encounters and the Alien set of legendary encounters and kind of shoved them all together and played them, which resulted in my sons wanting to watch Predator, which resulted in my sons having nightmares. So yeah, thanks a lot, Upper Deck. Thanks a lot. No, it's
Monkey 1, Monkey 2 nightmares.
Yeah, me being an awesome parent, apparently. How about you, Daryl? What have you been playing other than, baseball?
Yeah, been watching some baseball. It's crucial Blue Jays time. But also lots of prototypes. Actually, a couple of prototypes I've been really working on. I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for mentioning this, but I think I'm okay. But I'm working on a Space Invaders game. So
I heard that.
So I'm really pumped about that. And I'm also working on converting. I had submitted a game to IDW, and then they just recently said that they would really love it to be a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. So
there you go.
So I'm converting it to a Turtles game, which I'm really pumped about, because we actually kind of designed it with that in mind, but then we were told we couldn't do Turtles, and then now we can. So we're converting it back. So.
Who is the Space Invaders thing for?
Yeah, actually, they are a company that has not published games before. They actually make accessories, so like card sleeves, player mats, stuff like that. So
I know what you're doing.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, cool.
So working on a few things like that, but don't want to take up too much more time because we have some amazing guests, and we're talking about a really interesting topic. We're going to be talking about player count and talking through, some of the best games for different player counts, and also we'll tackle some of the design questions behind player count. So we brought not only a designer, but we also brought a couple reviewers so that Tiffany's not alone. And we can chat about, what are some of the hottest games with different player counts, but also talk about some of the design challenges. So as you can see, we have Gil Hova Formal Ferret, designer of amazing games like The Networks. And then we also have Jeremy Salinas and David. Oh no, I'm drawing a blank on your last name. Wainwright. Thank you. Man vs. Meeple. And if you have not been watching Man vs. Meeple, they have been putting out some amazing reviews and also some videos with publishers and a variety of different kind of looks at the industry. So you should be watching them if you're not already. Also, I just, David, you're going to have to unmute your feed. Sorry, we muted you. So with that said, I'm going to jump straight to actually Gil with our first question. And Gil, from your experience, do you have to factor player count when you design a game?
Yes.
Start us off. Tell us why.
That's the softball. You're starting me off with a softball.
I'm starting you off soft. Why does it matter? What do you think about when you're designing a game?
See, Gil, that we Canadians, unlike the Yankees, we play nice. Right,
well, you're talking to a Mets fan, so
okay. So you don't count then. Okay, good.
Yeah. As a Mets fan, I generally don't count. That's a
I forgot you were a Mets fan. I forgot that. Yeah.
So player count. So I'll start with the way that I do player count because it's really worked for me. I start with player count from the beginning. I think about the kind of game I'm making, and then I think about, well, what's the kind of player count that's realistic? That's an individual player count. So for a lot of games, that's going to be 3 or 4 players. So, I'm going to test the game with, say, 4 players. In my first few play tests, I'm specifically going to aim the game for 4 players. Because effectively, every different player count is a slightly different version of the game. And you really have to respect and honor that, because there's some amazing tipping points that we're going to get into that once you add or subtract a player, the whole characteristic of the game changes. And you really have to be on the lookout for the emergent complexity there, because that one simple change might make an enormous, and I mean enormous, this isn't hyperbole, like adding or removing 1 player, going from 3 players to 2, going from 4 players to 5, that's going to completely change the game and possibly even make it unplayable. So I start with a given player count, and once that's solid, then I start exploring the other player counts and seeing how the experience changes. Once I know the soul of the game at, say, 4 players, I'll say, okay, let me add a 5th player. Is the soul of the game still there, or has something changed? Same thing if I played it with 3 and now I'm dropping to 2.
Okay, good. Jeremy, let's ask some of the reviewers in the house. What are your thoughts on player count and what works in terms of rules when you have different player counts? Do you guys like it when they separate the rules out for different player counts depending on things that need to change, or do you like it kind of all mixed in?
Yeah, I'll throw a couple different things out there first. Number one, I despise games that lock you into a specific player count. Most specifically, I'll talk about Star Trek, where it comes in a game and you have to have 3 players in order to play the game, which functionally makes most people not be able to even approach the game or want to buy the game or pull it off their shelf when they have a group over. Talking specifically about rulebooks, of course, some of the best games out there have very specific rule sets based in the rules for 2 players or 3 players, and they take those rules and they highlight them in the rule book, which makes it a very accessible to a number of different players. But yes, locking players out with a very specific number of players, I can't stand that, and I typically try to avoid those games. So I don't know where David's going right now. He's exploring my house.
Yeah, I was like, where is he? This is just an adventure cam show now. Anyway.
I know, right?
Which could also be fun. That could be fun.
Yeah, I was hoping he would go down to the studio, but I guess not. Anyway, so Gil, the comment that you said different player counts are essentially different games. That's huge, and I think that a lot of Kickstarter designers fall in the trap of when they do a Kickstarter. People are like, oh, I want this player count. And so they're like, okay, we'll do it. Do you have experience with trying to tack on an additional player, maybe like a little later in development or something like that? What are the struggles of trying to add another player or remove a player even and go solo or lower player count?
Yeah, generally, like I've had a few games that I've done solo. And I admit that I usually do the solo version of my games fairly late. but solo is, to me, it's kind of a different beast because, I mean, every player count is kind of its own beast. And that's the interesting thing about it, is that the only player counts to me that are really similar to each other are 3 and 4. There's only slight differences between the two. But one player has such a unique set of constraints that I find that it's best to work on the other player counts first and then go to the solo game and see, all right, how can I get the spirit of this game with only one player? And with some games, it's not possible. Like Battle Merchants, I thought for a bit about how I could do a solo mode. Probably you could do a solo mode if you did like a Stegmaier-ish Automa system, but I wasn't up for that. So I decided to I decided to keep it at 2 to 4 players, and even that Battle Merchant's 2-player version of the game, it's good, but I had to put in enough rules that I got some backlash from players who felt like, well, there's a dummy player here. This doesn't work as well. It's not as smooth as the other player counts, and you'll find that if you put in like dummy players and things like that, you're going to get backlash. And that's, I think, one of the issues is if you stray too far from the base rules of the game, you're going to get that backlash.
Absolutely. I'm going to actually start a little bit of a ping pong back and forth between our reviewers and Gil, and start us off with talking through what are some of the best games for certain player counts. And then Gil can kind of maybe bring up some of the design challenges that will come up with those player counts. So I'm going to start with David and put you on the spot. Can you think of any games, recent ones would be great, but even just all time, that you really enjoy that can be played with solo mode? If you ever do play any games with one, that's a tough one. So Jeremy, feel free to jump in as well if you can think of a few.
I can jump in real quick. It's interesting because we are in the process of doing a lot of different reviews right now, and one of them that's been on the back burner for quite some time, and David, I don't think you've even played it, is the Orleans expansion Invasion.
Oh, yeah.
And it has 6 modes in it, 3 of which are solo play. And I have to say, I'm not much of a solo player myself, so I've played all of the other modes, the cooperative modes and the 2 other competitive modes, and I haven't even dug into them. So I think a solo, having that solo experience is very unique to very specific style of people. I typically am not a solo player. I've got a large enough gaming group, and I find games intrinsically to be a group experience. That's why I play games. That's why I play games now more than I play video games, because I have the opportunity to sit down at a table and experience that with a multitude of people and enjoy that interaction. So to answer your question, my question is not answering the question, I guess.
Yeah, I'll not answer it as well.
Perfect.
I mean, I feel the same way. There's a lot of other things I go to for, video games, other things for solo type experiences when I find myself without any friends around. But 2 players and up is really what I go to most for board games. In fact, I can't really think of any more modern games that I've played in recent memory solo. And if you don't mind, a slightly different answer to that question, aside from solo, and what I thought you were going to ask is, there's some games I've played that are meant, 2 to 4, which I think a lot of people originally thought were going to be higher player count games, but I found play so significantly better at 2 players compared to 3 and 4, which is kind of the opposite of most games that offer up to 3 and 4 players. Seasons being one of them. Seasons, I don't know if you've ever played it, but that game to me at 4 players is almost miserable in my opinion.
It's not good with lots of players.
And with 2 players, it's one of my favorite games, and it feels like a 2-player game. It feels like it was meant that way, which I think is unique, because I don't think there's a lot of games that play up to 4 that really feel best at 2-player. But that one definitely feels that way for me.
You can look at the flip side of that too, and look at a game like Blood Rage, which is fantastic at 5 players and is miserable at 2 players.
Yeah, you do not want to play Blood Rage with 2.
Yeah, anything with a lot of conflict, I think it depends. But when there's a lot of conflict, when it's all directed towards you from the other player, as opposed to being spread around, it's a little, it depends on the player, but it can either be a real drag, or people can get into that and go, head to head on that.
Sen?
Sure. So design-wise, Gil, what do you look for when you're designing a game that has maybe a big player count, and then trying to distill the same experience down when you have only 2? How difficult is that, and what kind of design tricks of the trade are you using to do that? Say with like battle merchants or something.
Yeah, that's difficult because Jeff Engelstein and Mike Fitzgerald recently tackled this on an episode of Ludology where they talked about chaos in games. And their term for chaos is very specific and very deliberate. They're not talking chaos as in, oh, I didn't get to do what I want. This game's so chaotic. Specifically, they're talking about chaos as the number of different directions that a system can go. So if you look at a game like Blood Rage, the interactions of the 5 players presents so many different possibilities. I don't want to use the word complexity because that's not the right word. The correct word is really chaos. The system is so chaotic that the result can be a bunch of different ways, and it's designed well enough that that each way that it could go is very interesting. So that's one of the ways you can get that chaos is by managing interaction with a lot of players. So naturally, once you start stripping out all those players and you take the same design and play it with only 2, it's not as interesting because you don't have that chaos. You need that extra actor to bring that chaos in. So the chaos has to come from somewhere else. Maybe it has to come from the game system. Maybe it has to come from some sort of random element. Maybe it has to come from some sort of deterministic element that's still so complex that it's tough to think through what all the possible results will be. So this is, I think, what the Automa system brings to the table. This is the system that Stonemaier Games has, and it's made by, I believe, Morten Monrad Peterson, I believe, is the name of the designer who's come up with the Automa system. But it's a deck of cards that when you play solo, you make your move, and then you flip a card, and the cards are designed in a way that they intentionally tell you what the opponent is going to do in a very calculated way. So it's not necessarily going to play optimally from the point of view of a player who's trying to win, but it is going to play well in the point of view of creating chaos in the system and making sure that you won't necessarily always be able to do what you can. So you've got to start making interesting decisions because not everything is going to be there. It relates to one more thing that I'll probably talk about a little bit later is Matt Wolf calls this the decision scales. I think decision scope is a better term, but pretty much the scope of what you can change in a game. So in a game like Blood Rage, there's a lot of global scope. You know, there's a lot of things in the game that everybody can change. Whereas if you look at a game like, say, Notre Dame, most of the things it's your own player board. It's a very local scope. You know, there are things that only you can do, and there isn't a lot that everybody can change. Generally, games with a local scope will scale better at different player counts, but they will be missing a lot of that chaos unless the system provides some sort of chaos to replace that. Whereas games with a global scope will be a lot more dramatic, but will tend to only play better at specific player counts, either high counts or low counts.
That's super interesting. I've never heard that take on it, which is, it's really interesting to me because Steve and I play a majority of our games 2-player. Just because since we've moved to Oregon, we mostly just have ourselves to play with. So it's interesting to see. And now that you mentioned that, I am thinking of, and I can think of examples and stuff like that. But what about Jeremy and David? I mean, I don't know if you guys just want to keep tag teaming questions.
Sure.
On the topic of 2-player games, you mentioned Seasons is a game that supports more players, but actually is one of your favorites, David, as a lower player count. What are other 2-player games which are your guys' favorite? Maybe an example of one that has a local scope and maybe one that has a global scope, if you guys can think that far based on Gil's question, because I think that's really interesting.
Are you talking about just strict 2-player games or games that are multiple players that can be played as 2?
I think I'm down for either. Anything that you feel is a really strong, like the best 2-player game, even if it does support more.
Well, in my opinion, a good 2-player game is something that you can set up, play quickly, and leave, almost kind of like a filler. So I would think games like Tides of Time, Tides of Madness, where the setup is literally 10, 15 seconds, The gameplay is quick to the point, and allows you to, once you're done, to literally shuffle the cards and reset and play again. Those games are enticing, I know, to David as well, just because they're easy to get in and out of, and you can, like I said, you can play it multiple times in one setting. Yeah,
to answer your question directly, I'd say Seven Wonders Duel is probably right up there for me for 2-player games. What I'm looking for is something that's not so simple. Like Tides of Madness and Tides of Time are good, but something else slightly north of a filler that has a little bit more depth, like Duel. We just recently played, was it Fight for Olympus from Mayfair, that had a nice back and forth. And both of those games also have a couple different victory conditions where you can sort of like sneak in the win, you know, like on Duel with science or military, or just wait it out. And then with Fight for Olympus has some similar mechanics too, where you can win, you know, in one of 3 different ways, which is just kind of a nice layer of depth to a 2-player game. Something a little bit more light would be something like a Jaipur. I know it's kind of a...
Oh, I love Jaipur.
Jaipur is a classic.
Sebastian Pechon, yeah.
Jaipur, I'll never turn down when someone says, "Hey, you want to play a quick game of Jaipur?" Like I'm in. I've never felt like, nah, I'm kind of tired of Jaipur.
I say we all go to a con and just go get David to play Jaipur for the whole con. He'll never turn it down, guys. He'll never turn it down.
I promise.
If you see David at a con, just be like, "Let's play Jaipur." Everyone on the internet, just keep that in mind.
It's funny.
Well, I'm going to jump back to Gil here. I know he has a little more to share about the scope topic that he was talking on, but I want to jump us forward to higher player counts. Not necessarily talking party, but let's say like 3, 4, 5-player games. What are some of the unique twists when it comes to designing those? Personally, I think 3-player is actually a very difficult player count to design for. I don't see a lot of games that are best with 3. So maybe talk a little bit about when it comes to games when you're designing the 3, 4, 5 player count. What are some of the challenges?
Well, let's talk first about, I think, something that's, a really interesting topic here, which is the jump from 2 players to 3 players. Because Jeremy and David mentioned something, that's really interesting, that in a 2-player game, every move that I might make is going to have some implication on you, in a 2-player game. It's all zero sum. Everything that hurts you helps me. Everything that hurts me helps you. That's just the nature of a 2-player game. Once you put in a 3rd player, that's no longer the case. Maybe a move that hurts David will help Jeremy, and while it helps me. Maybe a move that helps me slightly hurts Jeremy, but really hurts David. The point of this is not to hurt David, of course. The point of this is, that 3rd player is really significant. And I'm going to go back to that Chaos episode, because Jeff Engelstein brought up the 3-body problem, which is this thing in astronomy where if you have 2 bodies that are orbiting each other, 2 celestial bodies, mathematically it's relatively simple to plot out where they're going to be at any point in time from now to the end of eternity. I mean, it's mind-bending, but that's just how astronomy is. Just because space is so vast and there's so few other variables.
That doesn't sound relatively simple.
Yeah, but all it takes is just a simple equation or two, and you can plot out these positions. As long as you've got these 2 bodies that are orbiting each other. The moment you put in a 3rd body, you can't do it with a simple equation anymore. You have to brute force it. It becomes extremely complex because of the chaos that 3rd body puts in. And that's exactly the same with board games. Once a 3rd player comes in, you've got a significantly greater amount of chaos in the system. And you can no longer count on one player's move necessarily helping or hurting both of the other players. There's a lot of richness that comes out of it, but there's also a lot of complexity that comes out of this. And as a designer, you have to be really super careful about this. I think Patchwork, is a fascinating example, because Patchwork could have been a game that, with almost exactly the same components, the design, Uwe Rosenberg could have said, you know what, I can make this for 3 players. I can make this for 4 players. Just on your turn, just move the marker forward and take your piece and pay for it, and that's it. And when it comes back to you, wherever you are, that's where you are. And technically, it would work. it wouldn't be as good a game, but it would work. And I'm really fascinated by his realization that, wait, this works best as a 2-player game because the system is most interesting when I look at my choices and I say, well, these choices aren't great for me, but if I take this bit, it's going to be even worse for you. And that gets totally lost in a 3-player game because the only player you're really interacting with is the player on your left. So that's the jump to the 3-player game from a 2-player game. You really start getting that richness of complexity. And as you start scaling up, it becomes more and more like that. And you really have to start paying attention to this. I promise I'm almost done. I know I'm rambling, but it is kind of a big subject.
Gil, you're here for a good reason. We love
exactly.
it.
Gil, when you have your online lecture series on game philosophy and design, let me know because I'm signing up.
Oh yeah, no, I'll subscribe. Also, I'm taking notes, like literally, Gil.
Oh wow, I'm so flattered. I'm sweating now. Great, thanks. Guys.
Are you bullet journaling that?
I am bullet journaling this. Yes.
All right, we'll have to talk about that later. Bullet journaling and all that.
I understand, Gil, your point about chaos and all of that, but there's also a point in when the game is a game fun. And right now we're in the middle of doing a Kickstarter for a game that I won't mention, but at a 2-player game, which we have played, it loses a lot of the functionality of the game.
Absolutely,
and that's a problem with a lot of these large player games. The mechanics of the game work in a kind of an economy which requires multiple players to fuel the economy. When you have 2 players, that economy breaks down.
Yeah.
So that's a design challenge, and not just this game, but in multiple games that when you play them, the box may say 2 to 5 players, but when you play them at 2 players, they just don't work.
Yeah, that's where that interaction from that extra actor, you really need that. Because once you drop down to 2 players and you don't get that extra interaction, you miss that chaos, and the system just gets kind of dull. I experienced this with the networks. When I first tested the networks with 2 players, one of my play testers is Michael R. Keller, who designed Captains of Industry and City Hall, 2 very, very good games.
Yes.
And
highly underrated.
Very underrated. And so he tested the 2-player game, and he's like, yeah, this is okay, but it's boring. And he was right. The 2-player game originally, when I was working on it, was boring, and that was before I put in the burn mechanism. So what the burn mechanism is every 3 turns. Yeah, it's so important because every 3 turns, the game system takes cards away. So it models that extra actor. So now you're not just looking at what the opponent is taking away. There's this extra dimension of, I can't necessarily assume that these cards are going to be around. I have to plan for that, and that's that extra chaos that the game needed. And it sounds like, Jeremy, the game you're talking about needed that extra layer of chaos. So that when you went down to 2 players, there were still some interesting decisions to be made.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's move on to 3-player games. 3-player games are actually one of the areas that I love. I love 3-player games. What are your favorite 3-player games, Jeremy?
Ooh. Oh, are you serious?
Yeah. You could also say none.
I don't know if any game to me stands out as a 3-player game, but as Gil said, that extra person brings chaos and brings the decision making to the forefront. It's not a 0-sum anymore. You're making decisions against the whole play group. So I don't know. All my favorite games play great as 3-player games, like Twa.
Right.
That game is a fantastic game, 2 to 4, but as a 3-player game, it's fantastic because it's just one more person that you're trying to compete against in the cathedral and the military track and all those other type of things. We have Oracle of Delphi set up right now, which is the new Feld game. And once we're done with this, we'll probably play a 2-player game of it. But I'm excited to play it tonight as a 4-player game because Feld games are typically better the higher player count you have. Just because that controlled chaos, he's so good at designing his games that when you add those extra players, they add an extra dimension to the game that you just can't get in a 2-player game. As far as 3-player game, I don't. It's probably not a great question for me because I think any of these games play great as a 3-player. If it plays good as if it plays really solid as a 2-player game, it's going to play really solid as a 3-player game.
Yeah, I often feel too that 3-player actually often is the sweet spot when it's a 2 to 4 player game. I prefer 3-player over 4 and probably even 2 over 4 players because a lot of the games, and honestly, I think a lot of medium weight Euros, which is a lot of, sort of in mine and Jeremy's wheelhouse, not better that way. One thing I don't like is I don't gravitate towards games that require 3 players. There's more and more. In fact, we saw a lot of games come out of Gen Con that were 3 to 5 players on the box, and if it doesn't have 2 players as an option, that is problematic for me, because I do often find myself in situations to play 2-player games.
Yeah. So speaking of David, when you mentioned games that play 3 players, it made me think of games that specifically and only play 3 players, which is a really interesting design space. And every once in a while, I'd say every few years, you see a game like this. One is Rise of the Triumvirate, that came out, I think, 10 years ago. And then a recent one is Three Kingdoms Redo, which also came out. That came out like a year or 2 ago. And those are 3-player games, no more, no less. I wonder if you folks have played those 3-player games, the games that are really very specifically balanced for 3 players, and what you think of them.
I haven't. I got contacted a couple years ago about the Three Kingdoms one, and I passed it up on the simple notion that it was a 3-player game. And I've had the new Star Trek game since day 1 Gen Con, and we haven't got around to playing it. Again, maybe it's a mental barrier for me that I don't know. They turn me off for some reason. There's probably a reason why those 2 games that you mentioned before Star Trek haven't been huge hits in the board game community, because they're 3 players. That you're intrinsically saying that your audience has to have this player count, so you're automatically excluding all those people.
That's interesting, because Three Kingdoms Redo got some really good press, and I know that it's been pretty popular, especially with Heavy Cardboard and Heavy Cardboard's followers. But you get games that are 2-player only, and there's like a social acceptance of those. Why is it that 3-player? And I'm not challenging you. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just curious why 2-player games are okay and 3-player games don't have as much of a record in the marketplace.
That's a good question. I mean, typically, if my wife and I are going to sit down for a game at night when the kids are in bed, it's going to be a 2-player game. If I have David and his significant other over, it's going to be a 4-player game. If we have neighbors over, it's going to be a 4-player or a 6-player game or higher. I don't see myself ever in a situation except at a convention to play a 3-player game.
Yeah, Gil, I'd say, to answer your question too, I mean, I think that boils down to there just being more couples than trios. In the world. Literally. I mean, there's just everyone has more everyone finds himself with one other person probably more often than they find themselves with 2 other people in many cases.
I have to admit, there's something interesting and intriguing about the 3-player game, though. Yeah, sorry.
I'm super intrigued by the concept of what you were saying. A game specifically designed that way, so that it's. When I said 3 to 5, what I don't like about those is that generally those suggest the more the better. And that generally means it's a big, massive, long game, which that really starts to have a negative impact on my fun factor for almost any game. But something that's uniquely 3 players, where every player is playing a specific role of some sort, that's intriguing to me. Although I have to say, I don't think I've ever played one. I was trying to think ever since you mentioned it, but I can't think of one. Now I'm gonna have to do some research.
The 3-player discussion is super interesting, because I have seen the trend that you guys were mentioning, where more games are coming out that seem to have 3 to 5 players as the base, and I wonder if that's just because there is a stronger. I wonder if it's partially because there's a stronger demand for people to not just rush 2-player games, if that makes sense, because there's been so many 2-player specific reviewers coming out. But I actually want to talk about 4-player now. So, Gil, you were mentioning that in 2-player, it's this like tug of war almost equal sum system, and 4-player I feel has the potential of that, especially if we're playing with 2 couples. Because I've played some games where, you just go against your partner or something like that. But how does the chaos and the equal sum system work for a 4-player game when you're designing it, because it's also the one that I feel most companies aim or publish for is
Yes.
4-player.
Yeah, I mean, 4-player, you mentioned there's 2 ways to do it. If you do a 4-player partnership, it's effectively a 2-player game. You know, it's a 2-sided game. It's got its own wrinkles because there are 4 players in it. It's just that there's 2 teams. But to your question, I think you're really asking about the traditional 4-player game where out of the 4 players, there's generally going to be only 1 winner. So I think that's a really interesting thing because that's, I think, to me, I agree with you. Most publishers and designers, myself included, really look at the 4-player game as the real bedrock of the system. You know, you take 1 player out, and I find that I have to make some adjustments. I have to reduce the decision space sometimes. Whereas you add 1 player, and that's just the extra tipping point that increases extra chaos. And increases the player the time and the downtime, and it just becomes an issue. So it's interesting also because you look at the extra player count. So a 2-player game, given players of equal skill, 1 player is going to win half the time. Play a 3-player game, 1 player is going to win 33% of the time, given equal skill. 4-player game, now 1 player is going to win 25% of the time. And I think you're going to start to see like this extra level of challenge the more players there are. I think 4-player is about the limit of a strategy game. Some games are 5 players, but most of the time when you see a strategy game, you see that it maxes out at 4 players just because with a lot of strategy games, if they want to keep that global space and they want to keep a relatively low interaction, if they go above 4 players, it either starts to feel too chaotic or it starts to feel too boring. And an example, I think, is, well, let me take it up to 5 just for a quick instant. Alhambra, I think, is a great example of a game where the player count is not what it says on the box. You know, it says 2 to 6 on the box. It is not a 6-player game.
Never play 6.
No, never, unless you're playing with the Vizier's Favor. That's a good 6-player expansion. I think that works really. You disagree, Daryl? You don't think it works?
No,
even with
it's not. No, I don't play 6.
Oh, with the Vizier's Favor, it's actually that actually helps a lot. I think
it helps,
anyway,
but it doesn't. It's still not ideal.
Fair enough. So we can agree that 6-player Alhambra is problematic, and the reason is you make your decision, and there's no point in looking at the board until it comes back to you. It's just elevator music while everybody else takes their turn. And with a game like that, player's turn is just long enough that the downtime is just painful. So jumping back to a 4-player game, there are some times when in a 4-player game, that's about the limit, where if you add 1 more player, you're going to get that downtime elevator music issue. And you definitely don't want that in your design. You know, you want the turns to be quick enough, but also players' decisions to be interesting enough that when it comes back around to you, you've been thinking about your turn, and it's been worthwhile to think about your turn because the player to your right didn't just make the move that you wanted for the 5th straight turn. It's okay if that happens every once in a while in a really dramatic moment, but if it happens every single turn, then there's a problem with the game. So 4-player generally is the player count where you get everything seems to work in concert with each other. You know, you can keep the game state in a good enough place. Everything's reliable. Everything is, you can make decisions despite how many other players there are, et cetera, et cetera. Every once in a while, you get a game that doesn't work. And I think a good example that a lot of people have been talking about lately is Grand Austria Hotel. Have you guys played that?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Only 2 or 3 player.
Love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
No 4-player. No 4-player.
Yeah, no 4-player.
That's a great example of the player 1 takes their turn and then has to wait 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2. And even though the amount of measurable downtime is the same, like if you look at the total downtime, it would have been the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fact that you had to wait for 6 other turns until it comes back around to you is boring. You know, it's not that interesting, especially a game with as much to do on your turn as that one.
Yeah, long turns.
Yeah, and that also happens if you have a first player that rotates around the table. Like, I'm first player, I take my turn, then first player rotates, and I'm going to be the last player. So in that case, turns had better be quick, because otherwise you're going to be sitting around and waiting for a long time. Or you have something like Puerto Rico, where even if it's not your turn, there's still things you do on another player's turn.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Let's jump forward to 6+ players, and I'm going to push this question first to David and then Jeremy. Tell us a little bit about games. I know more your wheelhouse is games that are 3-4 player strategy games or 2-player strategy games. But have there been recently some games that have handled 6+ well, or are there some gems that you still go to if, say, you have some friends over, or you've gathered a bunch of people, or at a convention that are strong game experiences at 6+, and you can't really imagine them lower?
Sure. Well, once we start talking about 6 players plus, or upwards of 6 players, it really gets into more party game territory for me. I mean, I really can't speak to much experience where I'm playing a serious, even medium to heavy type game with that many players. But a lot of those games, even not a party game, but more of an experiential game, like I feel like Mysterium and things like that are really good with a high player count, but it's not as much of a quote unquote game, if you will. Something where we're all experiencing it together. That's where I think co-op becomes a little bit more interesting to me, which is not generally as interesting of a category for me. But when we're all in it together, particularly when you get 6 people together, you're just dealing with six personalities compared to maybe a couple. So finding those games that work with just about anyone becomes a little bit more important when you have that many people at the table.
And Jeremy, do you want to jump in with a few?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Seven Wonders always works fantastic, multiplayer. Recently played Secret Hitler, which is a really good social multiplayer game that scales really well, no matter how many players that you have. I think the baseline is 4 or 5. Yeah,
I think you need at least 4, at least maybe even 5 to make that game work.
Yeah, I think it is 5 up to 10. Those two. But the other thing I wanted to mention briefly, I don't think we've really touched on, is that a lot of gamers, including my wife, and I'll speak on her behalf, a lot of people enjoy games at a lower play count for this reason. They like building things in front of them. And the less players you have, the more you have the opportunity to build something and have an experience where you're looking at something from scratch be built out in front of you. As you add more players, that typically decreases. Now, there's some games that do that really well, like Civilization, Sid Meier's Civilization. No matter if you have 3 players or 4 players, you're still building this huge tableau in front of you. Same thing with Seven Wonders. It doesn't matter if you're playing with 3 players or you're playing with 7. You're still building the same number of actions in front of you. Now, that typically increases and your options decrease when you have multiple players. So that's something a lot of people consider when they're looking at a game. How does this scale? Well, it may scale mechanically great, but your options and your ability to play the game that you typically, say you play something really well in a 2-player game, say Zulkin, for example. When you add that 3rd and 4th player, your options become extremely limited because you have more things on the board. So that's something people should consider and people take into consideration when they buy a game.
Those are really good points, Jeremy. From a design perspective, Mr. Hova, what's going on once you get up above that magic 4 or 5 number? Are we really seriously all just party game designers at that point, or is there a way to get strategy?
There is absolutely a way to get strategy, because there's 2 directions you can go, and we're going to bring the scopes back into it. So one way you can do it is you can go. Well, most people think party games, they think of chaos, like really crazy chaotic party games. So that's an example of global scope. So look at 6 Nimmt, for example. You're pretty much, the whole appeal of 6 Nimmt is you're working on something that has a very tiny global scope. And the more players there are, the more chaotic it's going to be. And in the case of a design like 6 Nimmt, the more fun it's going to be and the funnier it's going to be. Because the whole fun of that game is its unpredictability. That I played this high card and I have no idea if I'm going to survive or not. If I'm going to, I might get away unscathed. I might be eating a lot of meat. We don't know yet. And I think that works because of its global scope, because everything that everyone plays goes into 4 shared columns that are right in the middle. And that's also why 6 Nimmt doesn't work so well with fewer players. It's really not a great 2-player game because it needs all that chaos in order to work. So that's global scope, and that's how a lot of party games function. They work off of that, that interactivity. The other extreme that you go to is going heavily in local scope. And Matt also used a different term. He said there's a third scope, adjacent scope, where it's between the two. So with adjacent scope, you're affecting other players, but you're not affecting every player. So Seven Wonders, I think, is a great example of a mix of local scope and adjacent scope. You can't do anything that affects everybody. I mean, technically you can, in that you can bury a card in one of your wonders and nobody else can use that card. And generally, technically that affects everyone else. But in terms of the global scope that we normally think about, that is not a game with any real traditional global scope. But it's got a great deal of local scope every time you play something in front of you. And then it's got a great example of adjacent scope, because your choices will generally affect your neighbors. Either you give them money to buy their resources, or you play military that attacks them. Or most importantly, whatever cards you pick will affect the choices of the players to your left or right, depending on what round you're in. So that's like the adjacent scope over there. And in a game like that, where there's a lot of local scope, a lot of adjacent scope, but not a lot of global scope, you'll see that that game is going to scale very well. And Seven Wonders does scale very, very well. I'd say from 4 players to 7 players. 3 players is okay. 2 players, you're better off playing Duel at this point. There's one more example I want to bring up, which I think is a fascinating example when it comes to player count, and that's Take It Easy. You folks, I don't know if you've seen a blog post that I wrote recently, but I defended games with low interaction, and that's generally games with a lot of local scope. There isn't a lot of ways you can mess with the other players. And Take It Easy is a game that is almost entire. It actually is pretty much all local scope.
Yeah, you're all building your own thing.
There is no interaction. There is literally no player interaction between everyone else. People say multiplayer solitaire, and they usually mean it in a pejorative sense. Take It Easy is multiplayer solitaire, and it's fantastic. It's a very, very good game. And I think some of the characteristics it has, because there is no player interaction, I've seen people host Take It Easy events at conventions where they tell everybody to bring as many copies of Take It Easy as they can, and then they have like a 100-player game of Take It Easy. And you can do that because it's a locally scoped game. So the scaling is just about infinite. So that's something you can do with a game that has that local scope. Now, of course, there's drawbacks. You can't really, it's tough to do a game with only local scope that lasts more than 20 minutes, because at some point you really want that juice that other players give you. You want that chaos.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Great stuff. I want to hone in on one of the specifics you talked about there, and that was that player interaction. And specifically, we're talking about different player counts and thinking through, games from different varieties of numbers, different scopes. And I want to jump back to Jeremy and David and talk a little bit about this year. I mean, because especially now that Man versus Meeple is going, you're really how many episodes are you in now?
I counted this morning. We're almost over 40.
Wow, that's incredible. Wow. Okay, so you're 40 episodes in already, which is incredible. And I'm curious, like, out of those games that you've looked at, what are some of the games that have done an incredible job of player interaction? No matter what the number is, that you each have maybe found is your favorite, and whoever has kind of thought of the answer first, jump in.
I'd have to say, just philosophically, that's a kind of subjective question.
Yes,
for sure,
absolutely.
Depending on how much player interaction you like. I'd say, we just played, and these are just recent memory. We just played Energy Empire, the new Manhattan project. It's worker placement, and that innately is the sort of the level of player interaction I like, where it's almost often passive interaction, where I may go someplace and it blocks someone out, but I might not even, that might not have been my point, but the other player still has to deal with it, whether it was my intent or not. I like that type of interaction. I'm less into games that promote more or even revolve around making you want to hurt your opponents. I like trying to score my own points. And if I'm doing something that keeps some points from my other players, that's great. What I don't like is I'm not a big fan of an even balance between when I'm looking at points I score and points I keep from my opponent from scoring as equal. Right. I like the balance to weigh a little heavier towards what I'm doing, and if I can take a few away, great. Sure. So Energy Empire was a good one. There's a few. Another great one that we played recently was Terraforming Mars, and there's not a lot of traditional player interaction in that, but again, the things that you're achieving on the board, you're almost doing all of the same things on the board, and depending on your timing in that game, you can really utilize the timing to sort of weasel in and get a spot on or achieve something that maybe another player thought they were going to achieve on that very next turn. That I like a lot.
Awesome. And Jeremy, do you have any examples?
A couple, yeah. I love player interaction. It's my absolute favorite. I like pushing people out. I like taking their spots. I mean, I enjoy that kind of stuff because it's give and take from the entire game. Blood Rage is a huge example of player interaction. It's constant. It's always in your face. Now, there's some newer games that we've reviewed that have player interaction, but they do it in a very fun and jovial type way, if that's even possible. But look at games that like Unfair, which the whole theme is built around, an amusement park and these unfair cards that are unfair to everybody, including some of them that are unfair to your opponents. And then there's games like Clank, where you are basically racing through a dungeon using deck building and trying to get out of the dungeon as quickly as possible and leave your peers underground to suffer and die. Those have player interaction in a way, but they're done in such a way that they're not so in your face. Now, the other game I want to reference is a game that's on Kickstarter called Chimera Station. That has some direct player interaction, not only in blocking, but pushing people out of spots. I enjoy that. I love that. I gravitate towards games like that with Conflict, Cry Havoc, which is another recently released game. I not only like the non-conflict, but I like the direct conflict as well.
Absolutely.
Well, the nice thing too, if I might add, on Chimera Station, when they mitigate some of the impact of those moves. For instance, when Jeremy mentioned you can knock people out of their spots, in Chimera Station, it sends you to an area where you get a little extra, like, consolation prize, if you will. So it's not that I find to make it a little bit more palatable for everyone. I'm not a big fan of interaction myself, but I also play with a lot of people who are even less fans of interaction. So I don't have a lot of fun when I'm, for instance, with my girlfriend, if I'm playing a game and I do something interactive that impacts her game negatively, the game ceases to be as fun as it once was, generally speaking, overall. Or the evening, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a little meta, though, right? You're getting
Sure.
a little beyond the beyond.
Sure. But that fun factor is a big thing for me. I'm a big fan when everyone gets up from the table and had a good time, regardless of the details and mechanics of the game.
Speaking of getting up from the table and everybody having a good time, that's a great segue, I feel, if there ever was one, to jump in and ask Gil about the game that you have coming to Kickstarter soon, which is Wordsy, which, interesting enough, supports 1 to 6 players, which really excites me considering all the conversations we've had about player counts and the difficulties of designing for them. So, tell us more about Wordsy.
Well, yeah, in terms of player counts, I'm really kind of nervous about it because there it is. There's Wordsy. So I'm a little worried about it in terms of it's 1 to 6 players, and I think you've seen in this conversation, we've said things like, well, it's 3 to 5 players, so that means it's more of like a that means it needs more players, or it's 2 to 4, which means it's more strategic, or it's 6+, which means it's party. People make inferences about games just from the player count alone. Like, they'll hear the player count and they'll say, oh, it must be like X kind of game. So generally, you'll see games that say there are 2 to 6 players on Kickstarter, and then you look at them and it's clear this game's going to play very poorly with 2, or this game's going to play very poorly with 6. So here I am going on Kickstarter with a 1 to 6 player game. But the thing is, it actually works really well with all those player counts because it has mainly local and adjacent scopes. It doesn't have a lot of global scope, so it scales very, very well. And because it's a short game, it's only 20 minutes, you're not going to miss that extra chaos, that extra spice that the global scope will usually give you. So, for example, in the game, it's a word game where there's 8 letters out on the board, and you come up with a word. You try to come up with the best possible word for that board. Then whoever is the fastest player to come up with a word may get a bonus if their word is equal to or better than half the other players. But if your word is better than the faster player's word, you get a bonus. So that's a great example, I think, of adjacent scope, because it's not all the players playing against each other. The only global element is the board, but you're not taking a letter doesn't prevent another player from taking a letter. So there's no real limitation there. Really, the scope is adjacent because it's just the adjacent player versus every other player at a time. So if I'm not the fastest player, I'm still going to go up against the fastest player, but I'm not going to go up against any other player. And because of that, the game scales really, really well. Now, I based this game off of Prolix, my first published game, and that game had a global scope because when it was your turn, you could come up with a word, but another player could interrupt you and take a word, take the word from you. And that is global scope because that board is shared. You know, while one player kind of has priority over the board, everybody else has a shot at it. As a result, the game only scaled to 5 players, and the 5-player game, I even had to write in the rule book, was very nasty because a player could get interrupted multiple times, and it didn't feel good. I recommend it only for experienced players, whereas Wordsy plays great up to 6 people, and there's no warning necessary because the scope is mostly local and adjacent. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it plays really, really well.
Excellent. So, Gil, you need to write like a thesis or something on scope, and you also need some patches on your elbow because then you can be like the crazy professor.
Well, Matt already wrote. Matt and the game designers of North Carolina have a great episode. On scope. They call it scales. They call it decision scales. That episode came out like 3 or 4 weeks ago. But Matt Wolf and game designers of North Carolina, their podcast is really good.
Really good episode. Really good episode.
Okay, so we're getting to our last question period time. So I wanted to ask Jeremy and David, if you have any advice for new designers or people who haven't got published yet about game player number count, what would it be? We'll start with Jeremy. Advice for new designers.
Make it always 2-player. It's got to have a 2-player count. No, I mean, the mechanics, no matter what, are what's going to drive the gameplay. Player count is really kind of irrelevant at the end of the game if the game just is not fun or enjoyable. And then you're going to, as Gil said at the very beginning of this segment, you have to scale it. You have to design it with an idea in mind of what you're trying to accomplish, whatever player count that may be, and then scale it down. Because if you scale it up, I don't think design. I'm not a designer, but I don't think design intrinsically in my head doesn't work that way. Making it a 2-player than trying to scale it up. You got to go the other way with it. But I would always consider a 2-player game. I think you just broaden your audience when you add that 2-player element. Once you lock yourself down into 3, listen, I'm a reviewer and I have games on my shelf that are 3-player only games. They're going to go to the back of the list because it's just not a wide audience of people that are going to watch that show because they're just not a wide audience of people buy that type of game. So that would be my suggestion.
All right, and David, sir.
Yeah, I would say one of the things, I mean, obviously this is from a consumer standpoint. I am not a game designer. So from a consumer standpoint, from an industry standpoint, I'd say one of the things that I've seen with player count is, and Jeremy and I have talked about this a lot actually, when we're playing a game and we see evidence that a lot of thought has been given to that scale, that's really meaningful to us as players. Because we've played a lot of games where all of a sudden we're looking at cards that are clearly not meant for a 2-player game. When you're getting X benefits based on the player count, a 2-player game, those cards are awful in your hand. So like for a good example, and I'm not just saying this because Gil is on, but I remember us having a conversation about the networks and all of the things in the networks that are built in that you put in there to adjust for player count. really, as soon as you see them, they seem like very clever and well thought out mechanisms to scale the game. And there are a lot of games out there that say 2 to 4, and clearly there is a lot of elements in the game that are meant for 4-player, or at least become significantly weaker at 2 players. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just a tell that maybe a lot of thought wasn't given to scaling it, and they just kind of labeled it 2 to 4 players from a marketing standpoint. So that's one thing that's definitely one thing I would consider.
Absolutely. Good advice there. Gil's used to this question on our show, but we are gonna give him a chance to also give it focused on our topic today. I mean, Gil not only is a great designer, but he also likes to share what he's learning through lectures and through a podcast. And I want to give you a chance, Gil, just to give a little plug of how people can connect with you, because you love encouraging new designers. I know that. And any advice you might give new designers when it comes to designing with player count in mind. What advice would you give, and also give a shout out for where people can find you?
Okay, so in that order, first off, you've heard 2 different things in this last hour, and they're almost contradictory. One thing is don't lie about your player count. Like, if your game plays best 2 to 4 players, don't put 2 to 6. If your game plays best 3 to 4, don't put 2 to 6. And that's important, because if you get your game says 2 players, people are going to play 2 players, and it better be good. It better be really, really good. I've seen some boxes nowadays put 3 to 4 players, 2-player variant. And that's a nice compromise, because it alerts people that you can technically play it with 2, but the rules change enough that it may not feel as natural as the 3 to 4 player game. That's not a bad compromise. So that's one side of things, is don't lie. But the other side of things is make the player count as wide as possible. Because, once again, you heard Jeremy's point. He's not going to review any games that are 3 players only. Obviously, that's an extreme example. But even a game that's 3 to 4 players is very limited. You need to go in one direction, go the extra number in one direction. Either that 3 to 4 has to become 2 to 4, or it's become 3 to 5. Because if it's only 3 to 4, that's extremely limited. Those 2 pieces of advice butt up against each other, because the solution is not to just call that 3 to 4 player or 2 to 4 player game. People are going to find out right away. There has to be some way you can find, even if you put on the box 3 to 4 with a 2-player variant, that might be okay. Okay, and also, ways to find me. If you're not tired of me talking yet, you can follow me on Twitter. I believe my little box over here says that information. @GilHova is how you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I've been blogging a little more lately, and I'm going to try to continue doing that. So that is gil.hova.net is my blog. I've got a post that I've been meaning to write lately, so I'm trying to get that one out. I also have a podcast as well called Breaking Into Board Games with Ian Zhang and Tony Miller, and we talk about breaking into the board game business from the point of view of a designer, a developer, and a publisher. And I take on the publisher role because I self-publish. And we were 28 episodes done already, and we're going to have our next episode with Daniel Solis next week. Woohoo. So we drop every Wednesday. I'm sorry, every other Wednesday, every 2 weeks.
Very cool. Sweet. So I'm going to break format a little bit. Zen, man, I'm dying.
Oh, me too.
Come on.
Let's find out.
So I'm going to read down the list of names first, just because I think everybody who applied for the game JoJo should get a little recognition.
Yeah.
And then I've actually picked 4 people.
4.
Wow.
4. Now, just so you know, as a Chinese person, 4 is a very bad number. This may go quite slow.
Do 3.
This may go quite slow. I don't have the time to do 5. I'm not even sure I have the time to do 4. So we're gonna try to make it.
But it's 2 times 2. It's 2 times 2. It's not 4.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting that into perspective.
My pleasure.
Okay, so, well, actually, it'd be half the luck because 8 is the lucky number. Anyway, so thanks to Ian Armstrong, Tony Miller, Chad Nolan, Eric Teo, Ryan Schoon, John Schulters. Oh man, there's so many of them. This is Hassam Malhijan. Oh, what is this name? I can't even read this. Oh, it's a really long one. Trevor Wills, Paul Becker, Kellen Freeman, Mark Richardson, Matthew Sanchez, Ian Brocklebank, Jeffrey Foxwell, Bain Williams, Bill Corey, Chris Rollins, Dave Shepard, Bob Wyman, Matthew Graveland, Joshua Jones, Scott Starkey, Devin Weir, Theo, I can't pronounce your name, Rob Nolan, Jeff LaFlamme, Aaron Wilson, Darren Broad, Joshua Grimier, Stephen Wilhelm, Devin Stinchcombe, Tyler Lipchin, Steve Caires. Who's that guy? And Scott
Some guy.
Yeah, some guy. So those are all the applicants. There's like 36 of them.
Hey, Sen, I've got a question.
Sure. What's up?
What is Game Dojo?
Oh, yeah. So Game Dojo is where I'm going to basically mentor some new designers who haven't really got their break yet. I've been blessed by being lucky a lot of times in the game industry. A very lucky thing that happened to us was being invited to Alan R. Moon's Gathering of Friends. And that kind of led to everything that happened in my life in the recent, last 5 years. And so, I mean, Daryl can attest to that kind of thing, that, going to the gathering is awesome. But then also, I was Daryl's mentor for the Game Artisans of Canada, and look at him now, he's awesome. And he was great before, but he's even better now through the process that we use in Game Artisans, the mentorship process. And I thought, well, you know what, it's kind of, nationalistic to just limit it to Canadians. So I thought, well, let's go beyond that and see if there's other people who need assistance because they just can't seem to get their foot in the door or something like that. And if there's anything I can do in terms of putting people together or giving advice, then I would gladly do that for them. And so I opened the contest or the application process to people who haven't been published before, who, I would prefer it's people that I know but don't know so well that I see them on a weekly basis anyways, or they have access to me in other means. And so there's some people on the list who, I love you guys, you're my best friends in some ways, but I'm not going to do the Game Dojo with you. You can just talk to me one-on-one because you have my phone number and you come to my house and play games. And so you're off the dojo list, but you're in my heart somewhere. And then there's some people who applied that have games published already, and that to me is one step beyond where I wanted to go. So it's not a disrespect to your game design ability or your game idea. It's just I want to help people who haven't been there yet, who really are on the cusp, not because you don't need assistance, but because they really do. And so in regards to that, here are the four people that I did pick to work with. And there's a little bit of my own bias in whom I picked. It's because I'm interested in their projects, interested in them as people, and interested in what I can learn from the project as well. So it's not all altruistic. Sorry, there's some of it that's a bias on my part. So the first one, if you guys give me a drum roll, I picked Ryan Schoon, who's making a game about privatized first responders, which sounds really cool to me. Also, Ryan has a lot of experience in RPGs, whereas that's something I'm getting into. So I thought, this might be mutually beneficial, that I can help him with that. He can help me with the RPG stuff. Bob Wyman is a college professor. I'm also a college professor, and he teaches in a STEM class. He's making a game called Outlast, and I'm always interested in the use of games in education. So that's somebody I would really like to assist in seeing where we can take that type of thing. Devin Stinchcombe is making a game about time travel, and time travel is the freaking holy grail of game design for me. Pretty much. I've never been able to come up with something that's time travel related, so I'd love to help somebody else do it. And then, again, some Steve Caires guy. Honestly, and it's not because Tiff, it has nothing to do with you.
Oh no, I
to do with
Steve
Steve.
As much. Yeah.
You know what it was? You know what it is? It's the freaking name of the game. It just made me laugh.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Steve's game is called Han Solo, and
it's so good.
Another reason is because it's a solo game, and I've honestly wanted to, and I'm trying to make a solo game as well, and I want to see what the thought process is going into making something like a solo game. So anyways, those are the 4 people that I'll get in contact with you guys off this stream, and we'll start talking about how we're going to work out the game dojo. So congratulations to Ryan, Bob, Devin, and Steve. Be expecting a call or an email from me in the near future. And to all the other applicants, your applications were awesome. I loved reading through them, and hopefully we'll get to work together in the future. There may be Game Dojo 2, who knows? Excellent.
Awesome stuff. So just want to say thank you again as well with Sen. Just thank you for applying, and stay tuned for those designers and the other designers that applied, what might come out from them. Before we disappear, I would be remiss if I didn't give Jeremy and David just a quick second to give a plug of what upcoming episodes are coming up with Man vs. Meeple. I'm a big fan, so even just spoiler. Just knowing I would be excited about. So do one of you want to give us just a little heads up and tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find us, of course, on YouTube at Man vs. Meeple. Check us out on Twitter at Man vs. Meeple and Facebook as well. We always do contests for our reviews. We always give away a free copy, so make sure that you guys make comments on Facebook to be entered into that. And what do we have coming up? We are playing Oracle at Delphi today, which is the new failed game.
That one's kind of gone to the top of the list right at the moment.
Yeah, can't blame you.
And then hopefully in the next week we'll get Great Western Trail, which is a new Alexander Pfister game.
Great
game.
Great
hopefully the new Jorvik.
Also a good game. Nice. The Eggertspiel / Strongholds.
Yeah, I'm a huge Euro guy, so when people throw worker placements and Euros in my face, they go to the top of the list.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you'll enjoy them. I'm a little biased, but I got to play test those, and I'm a big fan of them both. So I just want to say thank you. Gil, always a pleasure. We always love having you on the show. And Jeremy and David, this is a pleasure to have you on as well. Give a nice little different perspective from the reviewer side. We love what you're doing, and keep up the great work. It's not only great reviews, but great quality, and just a huge addition to our hobby, and we really appreciate that. So for any of our viewers, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, or if you're looking to see what's going on, you can check us out at themeeplesyrupshow.com. You can find us on YouTube or on Twitter. We love interacting with any of our viewers. If you have questions, don't feel like the dojo is the only way that you can get our help. We love interacting in small ways, whatever way we can, with designers out there. And meanwhile, just keep making great games, and we look forward to playing your game soon. Have a great day.
Let's dance.
Come on, Jeremy.